The stepmother forced her dark-skinned stepdaughter to marry a disabled man in order to get rid of her. But 6 months later, he returned in a black limousine and with a name known throughout the city. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The Harper estate stood at the edge of a quiet suburb, surrounded by wrought iron fences and manicured hedges that curved like polished waves around a grand white house. To passers-by, it was the kind of property that whispered wealth in every brick, every trimmed rosebush, every shining window pane. But to Ivy Harper, it had long stopped feeling like home. If anything, it was a gilded prison. Its beauty only emphasized how little she belonged inside it. At 19, Ivy had learned to become invisible. She had mastered the art of silence, of soft steps, of blending in with walls and shadows. In the early hours, before the sun fully lifted the darkness off the lawns, she swept the marble floors of the grand hallway, her bare feet numb from the cold, her hands stiff from the rough handle of the broom. Above her, laughter drifted from one of the upstairs bedrooms. The voices were unmistakable. Lauren and Ashley, her stepsisters, awake far too early, already giggling over something shallow and cruel. She didn't need to guess what it was about. It was always the same: her hair, her skin, her posture, her silence. Ivy had grown used to the rhythm of their ridicule, the snickers behind her back, the way they tossed their laundry near her like she was some live-in appliance. She never said a word. She couldn't afford to. Years ago, before her father died, this house had been a place of warmth. Harold Harper, an esteemed architect known for designing sustainable homes and community centers, had been her anchor. He used to call her his Queen of Lines because of how she loved to trace the edges of his blueprints, asking what each line meant. He had promised to teach her how to build houses with her mind, how to sketch beauty from scratch. He would sit beside her on the porch steps, hand her a pencil, and tell her to draw what safety looked like. But Harold had married again. Mira Winslow was nothing like Ivy's mother. She came from a line of socialites and politicians, all polished smiles and champagne values. To the public, Mira was grace incarnate. To Ivy, she was steel-wrapped in pearls. When Mira entered the Harper house, she brought with her 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Lauren and Ashley, both fair-skinned, blue-eyed, and quick to spot Ivy as an outsider. When Harold died suddenly of a heart attack, alone in his study late at night, everything shifted. The next morning, Mira cried in front of reporters, wore black silk, and held Ivy's hand in front of cameras. But, behind closed doors, she locked Ivy out of her father's office and summoned a lawyer. Within weeks, the estate had been quietly transferred. The will, which Harold had supposedly updated to leave everything to his new wife, left Ivy with nothing. No share of the house, no inheritance, not even the right to stay. But Mira, ever the public darling, told the community that she was letting the girl stay out of the goodness of her heart. Ivy became a shadow in the home she used to dream in. Her room was now the cramped storage closet beside the laundry chute, a cold, damp space where old curtains and boxes of broken decor were stored. Her blanket was a repurposed tablecloth. Her pillow was made of old shirts. The door had no lock, but it barely needed one. No one ever came down there unless they needed something cleaned. She woke each day before dawn, swept the house, cooked breakfast, then disappeared to wash dishes and scrub tiles. She was not allowed at the dining table. She ate in the kitchen, standing, often waiting for leftovers or burned crusts. Mira insisted this was a matter of order. Lauren and Ashley simply found it hilarious. "You know, even the maid at Dad's office gets to eat lunch sitting down. Lauren once said, watching Ivy spoon lukewarm oatmeal into her mouth. Ashley laughed and added, "She should be grateful we feed her at all." But Ivy never reacted. That was the only power she still had, denying them her pain. She saved her tears for the closet at night, where she lay curled with her father's old flannel shirt clutched to her chest. Inside a small shoebox, under her makeshift bed, she kept 3 things: a faded photograph of her and her father on the beach, a graphite sketch of a tiny house she once drew with him, and a letter he had written months before his death. The envelope had yellowed with time, but the ink was still sharp. "If something ever happens to me," the letter read, "know that I loved you. Know that you are worth more than anything I've built. And know that I've asked someone I trust to look out for you, someone who understands how to protect things of value." She had read it 100 times, maybe more. She didn't know who this mysterious someone was. The letter never said. Maybe it was a bluff, a father's hope. Or maybe it was real and they just never came. But Ivy didn't let herself believe in rescue anymore. One morning, as she trimmed the hedges along the driveway, her fingers raw from the shears, she noticed a luxury car slowed down as it passed. It didn't stop, but the driver stared at the house intently. The tinted windows concealed the inside, but she felt the gaze. It lingered for a few seconds too long, then the car disappeared around the bend. She thought nothing of it. A week later, she found a burn on her wrist after scrubbing Mira's marble countertops with undiluted bleach. When she mentioned it quietly, Mira's response was swift. "You should be more careful. We can't afford to send you to a hospital every time you scratch your skin. Or would you prefer I deduct it from your meals?" Lauren and Ashley laughed as Ivy lowered her eyes. No one offered help. No one ever did. That night, the letter felt heavier than usual in her hands. She reread it once more, gripping it as though it could transport her somewhere else. She whispered her father's name like a prayer, hoping his words still meant something somewhere in the world. She was unaware that, on the other side of town, someone else had taken out a similar letter, older, folded at the corners, and was reading it under the warm light of a private study. A man whose face the world no longer remembered. A man in a wheelchair who hadn't always needed one. He looked at Harold Harper's signature, then turned his gaze to the fireplace, where a photograph of 2 young architects in hard hats smiled back at him from a distant past. Outside the Harper estate, the wind picked up, sweeping dry leaves across the gravel path. Ivy watched them swirl like tiny dancers before settling into stillness. She didn't know it yet, but change was coming. And it would begin with a letter. The next morning unfolded like every other in Ivy's world, quietly, indifferently, and with the cold efficiency of a life measured by tasks. She had been up before sunrise, her body trained to rise not by alarm, but by the habitual ache of duty. She swept the marble floors again, moving around the wide stairwell like a ghost, careful not to make noise. Upstairs, Lauren's high-pitched voice echoed faintly behind the door of her bedroom, mixing with the faint beat of pop music and the clink of jewelry boxes. Ivy didn't pause to listen. She made her way to the kitchen, where she began slicing fruit for the morning's breakfast tray. Mira had insisted on fresh berries and avocado toast that day, her newest obsession gleaned from some influencer's story online. Ivy worked silently, her hands steady even as the ache in her wrist reminded her of the chemical burn from the week before. No one had asked about it. No one ever would. The house was beginning to stir when a knock came at the front door. Not the hard, impatient kind that deliveries brought, but a gentle, deliberate tapping. Mira was upstairs, as were her daughters. Ivy hesitated only a moment before wiping her hands on her apron and walking across the foyer. She opened the door just enough to peer out. A young man in a courier's uniform stood there, expression neutral, holding a brown envelope addressed to Mira Winslow. Ivy reached for it, but the man paused. "Are you Miss Ivy Harper?" he asked. She froze. No one used her full name. Not in this house. Yes, she said softly. He handed the envelope to her directly. "Signature, please." Still stunned, she signed where he pointed and watched him retreat down the steps and disappear behind the iron gate. She looked down at the envelope again. It was handwritten. Elegant script, no return address. The paper was thick, the kind used for formal invitations or old-fashioned correspondence. She turned it over in her hands, then looked upstairs instinctively, half expecting Mira to be watching. But the corridor was quiet. She slipped the envelope under her apron and returned to the kitchen, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. Later, when the breakfast tray had been delivered and the dishes were soaking in the sink, Ivy retreated to the laundry room. She closed the door, sat on the floor beside a stack of damp towels, and finally opened the letter. "Dear Miss Ivy Harper, if this reaches you, it means your father's last wishes have found their path. My name is Daniel Sloan. I was once your father's closest friend and business partner. Before his passing, we made a promise to look after each other's children should anything happen to either of us. I have followed your situation with care and concern, though from a distance. Recent events have compelled me to act. I humbly request the opportunity to fulfill that promise, not through charity or obligation, but through a proposal. I wish to seek your hand in marriage. I understand how strange this must sound. I am a man bound to a wheelchair. I live a quiet life outside of the spotlight that once surrounded our families. But I have not forgotten who you are, Ivy. I believe in your worth. Should your guardians permit it, I would like to formally ask to court you. I leave the decision to you. With respect, Daniel Sloan." Ivy sat perfectly still, her fingers trembling slightly around the paper. The name meant nothing at first. Sloan. The syllables rolled around in her mind like marbles. She blinked once, twice, then reread the letter. Marriage? A man in a wheelchair? A business partner of her father? It made no sense. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it inside her shirt, not daring to throw it away, though unsure why. For the rest of the day, the words clung to her like mist. Every step she took, every task she performed, felt dreamlike. By mid-afternoon, she convinced herself it was a prank, perhaps one of Ashley's cruel tricks, or Mira's new method of humiliation. But that illusion shattered when she overheard Mira laughing on the phone that evening. "I swear to you," Mira said between chuckles, "he wants to marry one of my daughters, a crippled man. Who does he think he is?" Ivy stood frozen outside the parlor, her back pressed to the wall. "Well," Mira continued, her voice laced with mockery, "I've got just the girl for him. She's practically baggage in this house anyway. He wants a Harper daughter, right? He'll get one. I'm going to give him Ivy." The words slammed into Ivy like a slap. She turned away, stumbling back down the corridor before Mira or the girls could notice her presence. Her vision blurred, her chest tightening with a sensation too bitter to be called fear and too sharp to be called grief. She had no say in the matter. She never did. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of her closet, the letter in her hands, the pages slightly damp from her fingers. She reread the words again and again, as though somewhere between the lines she might find a hidden escape clause. The next morning, Mira summoned her. She stood in the living room like a queen announcing a royal edict. "You're getting married," she said flatly. Ivy said nothing. To a man who thinks marrying a Harper will elevate his pathetic existence. He's in a wheelchair, can't even walk, probably drools in his sleep. Ashley and Lauren burst into laughter. "But lucky for you," Mira added, "he's willing to take trash, so we're giving him trash." Ivy swallowed hard, her voice quiet. "I don't want." "You don't want?" Mira's eyes flared. "You don't want? This is not a matter of what you want. You have no dowry, no name, no value. He's doing us a favor by taking you." Ashley chimed in. "Think of it as a charity case. Maybe he'll teach you to roll around properly." Lauren clapped sarcastically. "We should throw her a bridal shower, get her a broom and a pair of crutches." Ivy didn't reply. She had learned, after so many years, that words only fed their cruelty. In the days that followed, preparations for the so-called marriage began. Mira ensured it would be nothing more than a transaction. No guests, no ceremony, no celebration. Ivy would be handed off like a parcel. One evening, Mira placed a tattered suitcase at her door. "Pack your things, whatever you own, not that it's much." Inside the suitcase, Ivy placed the same 3 items she always kept: the photo, the sketch, and her father's letter. And now, Daniel's letter joined them. On the morning of her departure, Ivy stood in the front hallway dressed in a faded dress that barely reached her ankles. Her hair had been pulled back harshly by Loran, who had laughed the entire time. Ashley tossed an old scarf at her shoulders and said, "Something borrowed." They pushed her toward the front gate, where a black car waited. A man sat inside, motionless, hands folded, his wheelchair visible through the open door. Ivy approached, her steps heavy, her eyes lowered. Mira watched from the porch, arms crossed. "Go on," she said, "your prince awaits." Laughter echoed behind her as Ivy opened the car door and climbed inside. She did not look back. The car pulled away slowly, its tires crunching over the gravel path. Ivy stared ahead, not daring to glance at the man beside her. He remained silent. The road curved out of the gated community, past hedges, past tennis courts and fountains, then onto the freeway. Only when the estate disappeared from view did Ivy allow herself a breath. She did not know where she was going. She did not know this man, but somehow, for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was simply waiting. The silence inside the car was thick but strangely bearable. Ivy sat with her back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the scenery rushing by through the tinted window. Trees blurred past in soft, green streaks, the occasional mailbox or lamppost breaking the rhythm of the highway. Her pulse thudded beneath her skin, steady and tense, but not panicked. She had imagined this moment 1,000 ways during the sleepless nights leading up to her departure. In every version, she had been terrified, shaking, desperate to flee. But now, sitting in the cool, air-conditioned vehicle beside a man she'd only glimpsed briefly, she felt a strange numbness, like she had stepped out of her own life. The man said nothing. He sat beside her, still and composed in his wheelchair, dressed in a dark, tailored suit that didn't match the image Mira had painted of him, a pathetic cripple begging for love. There was dignity in the slope of his shoulders, in the quiet way he folded his hands, in the thoughtful way he occasionally glanced out the window. He didn't try to speak. He didn't even look at her. And Ivy, caught between fear and confusion, didn't dare to speak first. They left the city behind before she realized it. Skyscrapers shrank in the rearview mirror, replaced by fields, then gated communities, then winding private roads lined with iron fences and lush green hedges. The car finally turned onto a narrow drive, bordered by tall trees that arched overhead, casting speckled shadows onto the pavement. At the end of the road stood a house unlike any she had expected. It was not a mansion, not by the conventional standards of Mira's social circles. It wasn't gaudy or showy, not dressed in white stone or gold trim. Instead, it was tasteful, modern but warm, a blend of wood and glass and stone that stood tall and peaceful against the forest backdrop. Its windows stretched wide, as though inviting the world in. Ivy stared at it, confused, her grip tightening on the handle of her suitcase. The car rolled to a gentle stop. The driver stepped out and opened her door without a word. The man in the wheelchair gestured lightly for her to follow. She hesitated only a second before stepping out, the soles of her thin shoes pressing into the gravel. The air smelled different here, cleaner, quieter, full of birdsong and the faint trace of pine. He wheeled ahead without speaking, and she followed him up a stone path that led to the front door. Inside, the house was bright. Sunlight poured through the open layout, illuminating hardwood floors and sleek furnishings. The walls were adorned with abstract paintings and photographs, each carefully framed and placed. There were books, real books, stacked on tables and shelves, not just as decoration but with signs of use. Dog-eared pages, bookmarks, notes scribbled in margins. It didn't look like a place where cruelty lived. The man turned to her finally, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since they left Mira's house. His expression was calm but firm. "You can put the suitcase down," he said. His voice was steady, low, and even. She nodded and placed it on the floor beside her, unsure what to expect next. "I imagine you have many questions," he said. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The words wouldn't form. Her heart beat faster now, anxiety rising where numbness had been. He noticed. "I'm not here to harm you, Ivy," he said gently. "In fact, I'd like to begin by telling you the truth." He moved away from her, wheeling slowly across the open living room toward a side hallway. Without thinking, she followed. Her footsteps felt heavy on the floor. He stopped near a long mirror hanging between two windows and turned to face her. "Everything you were told about me, by Mira, by those girls, it was designed to humiliate you, to make you feel like you were being cast away." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I'm not paralyzed." The breath caught in Ivy's throat. She didn't move. "I don't need this wheelchair," he continued. "Not anymore." And then, without flourish or hesitation, he stood. It wasn't clumsy or staged. He simply rose from the chair as if standing after a long rest. His movements were fluid, practiced, assured. Ivy stepped back instinctively, her hand reaching for the wall behind her. Her pulse roared in her ears. He didn't approach her. "I had an accident years ago," he said calmly. "I went through rehab. I recovered, but I kept the chair because I needed to see something for myself. Your father and I made a promise to look after each other's children. When he died, I was in another country, tied up in business and lawsuits. By the time I returned, everything had already changed. I tried to make contact, but Mira had built walls around you, no lawyers, no calls, no access. I thought if I came as myself, wealthy, healthy, with questions, she'd only hide you further." Ivy's throat tightened. She wanted to speak but couldn't. "So I became someone she wouldn't respect," he said. "Someone she wouldn't fear or see as a threat. And it worked. She handed you over as if you were an old coat she didn't want anymore." His voice didn't change, but there was something sharp behind it now, anger held in check. "I didn't do this to trick you, Ivy. I didn't want to hurt you. But I had to know who in that house had a heart left, who still saw people as people. It was you. The silence that followed was deafening. Ivy stared at him, her mind spinning, unraveling. She should have screamed, should have demanded answers, should have turned around and run back into the woods, but instead, all she could think was, someone saw her. Someone chose her. "Why me?" she whispered. Daniel looked at her carefully. "Because you didn't laugh. You didn't ask what I could offer you. You didn't scorn me. You didn't refuse to look at me. You said nothing cruel. You accepted what little information you had and still treated me with quiet decency." Ivy's fingers trembled against the wall. He stepped back and sat down again in the wheelchair. "I want you to stay here," he said. "Not as a wife, not unless you choose that, but as yourself, as Ivy Harper, as the daughter of a man I loved and respected, as someone who deserves rest." She didn't reply. "There's a guest room prepared. You can take your time. No one will bother you. You're free here, Ivy. For the first time in years, you're free." And then he turned and wheeled away, giving her space. She stood there in the hallway long after he disappeared down the corridor. Her breath finally came in slow, ragged waves, her shoulders slumping as the weight of years began to shift. Her feet moved eventually, carrying her toward the guest room. When she opened the door, she found a room filled with soft light, with fresh sheets and a simple bed, a small desk with a lamp, and a single window overlooking a grove of trees. On the nightstand sat a book of architectural sketches. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Ivy slept without fear. The first morning Ivy awoke in her new room, she did not rise with dread or hurry. She remained in bed, watching the sunlight paint soft patterns on the wall, listening to the silence that, for once, did not feel oppressive. The walls of this room did not judge her. The sheets beneath her did not itch or smell of mold. Her name had not been yelled through the door like a command. No footsteps charged toward her to drag her into servitude. It felt unreal, like the pause in a dream before the scene shifted back to nightmare. But it didn't. The nightmare didn't come. She finally sat up, the architectural sketchbook catching her eye again. She had touched it the night before, fingers grazing the edge of the paper, but she hadn't dared open it. Now, in the morning calm, she let herself leaf through the pages. Diagrams of open floor plans, notes in clean handwriting, delicate outlines of rooftops and pillars. Each drawing whispered a language she hadn't spoken in years. The language of form and design, the dreams she had once shared with her father on a worn porch in another life. She didn't hear Daniel approach. When he gently knocked and opened the door, she flinched before remembering where she was. He paused, noting her expression, then offered a polite smile. "Good morning. There's breakfast, whenever you're ready." She nodded, too surprised to speak. He left without further words. In the dining room, there was no grand table seating 12 or expensive centerpieces nobody touched. There was just a table of polished wood, sunlight falling across a set for two. Toast, fresh fruit, eggs, and tea were arranged with care, but without extravagance. Daniel waited for her to sit first. She hesitated, unused to such regard, but eventually took her place. They ate in companionable quiet for a time. Then he spoke, not looking at her directly, but watching the morning light. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here today." "I didn't know where else I'd go," she replied softly, her voice hoarse with disuse. "You're not here because you have nowhere to go," he said gently. You're here because you deserve to be." Her throat tightened. She said nothing. The next days passed slowly. Ivy began to find a rhythm. Daniel gave her space, more than she knew what to do with. There were no chores assigned, no schedules imposed. He offered her books, a sketch pad, access to the garden if she wanted fresh air. He didn't ask questions about her past, nor did he demand she explain her silences. And though he was often working in his study, she sensed he was nearby when she needed reassurance. She spent her afternoons walking the garden paths or sitting on the wide stone steps, a notebook in her lap, drawing rooftops and windows. Her hands remembered the strokes. Sometimes she added whimsical touches, a round window like an eye, a roof shaped like a leaf. She didn't know what she was building, but she built anyway. In the evenings, Daniel made dinner or ordered something in, and they ate quietly. Sometimes they spoke about architecture, the places Ivy wanted to visit, memories of her father. Sometimes they didn't. The silence between them grew less heavy, more like the pause between breaths than a void. One evening, after a particularly long walk through the trees, Ivy returned to find a stack of envelopes on the hallway table. She wouldn't have paid them any attention, but one bore the name Harper in bold letters. Curious, she brought it to Daniel. He took it, opened it carefully, and read silently. Then he looked up. "It's starting." "What is?" "The house, the people who lived in it." It took her a moment to realize he meant Mira. He handed her the letter. It was from a real estate broker. Mira was attempting to sell off parts of the estate's land. Quickly, discreetly. A note scribbled in the margins mentioned desperate cash flow issues. Ivy stared at the paper. It didn't surprise her. It didn't even anger her. It simply clarified something. "She's losing everything," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "She built her comfort on fraud," he said. "Eventually, those foundations crack." Ivy folded the letter and set it aside. She didn't speak again that night. Over the next weeks, the unraveling of Mira Winslow's world became more visible. Ivy didn't seek out the news, but she overheard Daniel's phone calls, and once, late at night, curiosity led her to open his laptop when he'd stepped away. An article on a local site detailed a lawsuit involving Mira's embezzlement of funds from a charitable trust her late husband had once co-founded. Anonymous sources were quoted. Photographs from parties, once symbols of glamour, were now attached to headlines of scandal. And then came the photos. Ivy saw them first on a magazine cover in a waiting room at a gallery Daniel had taken her to. There she was, standing beside him at a fundraiser, wearing a simple navy dress and a small necklace. Her smile was faint, uncertain, but unmistakably hers. The headline didn't use her name, but the caption read, "The mysterious companion of Daniel Sloan steps into public light." It wasn't until the next day, when she heard a voicemail message on Daniel's office phone from a name she hadn't heard in weeks, that she understood the panic building in her old home. Mira's voice was shaky, forced into civility. "Daniel, it's Mira. I hope you're well. I saw the news. Just wanted to touch base. Perhaps we could talk. Over coffee. Soon." He didn't return the call. A week later, Ashley sent an email. Ivy read it over his shoulder. It was cloyingly sweet, laced with faux humility and casual inquiries about her well-being. She didn't reply either, and yet none of it prepared her for what Daniel did next. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, he turned to her with an expression more serious than usual. "Ivy," he said, "I've thought long and hard about this. I didn't bring you here for obligation. I never intended to pressure you. But I would like to ask, formally, without expectation, if you would consider marrying me. Not because our fathers planned it, not because Mira forced it, but because I see in you someone I want to build a life with." The sun filtered through the trees above, dappled gold on the stone path. Ivy didn't answer right away. Her heart was racing. Her thoughts tripped over one another. "I don't know how to be that," she said at last. "You don't have to know," he said simply. "You only have to want to learn. Together." Her chest ached, not with fear, but with something like longing. "I do," she whispered, and just like that, something shifted. He reached for her hand across the table. She let him. The next morning, she received a box. Inside was a ring, not large or ostentatious, but delicate, with a band shaped like entwined vines and a small sapphire in the center. She wore it on her finger that entire day without looking at it directly. Elsewhere, the cracks in Mira's empire spread faster. Former friends avoided her. Clients pulled out of partnerships. Her name was whispered with scorn at events she was once adored at. The final blow came when Ivy received a formal invitation. Daniel placed it in her hand, watching her carefully. "It's your wedding," he said softly. "You get to decide everything." She stared down at the card. Her name was printed beside his. Ivy Harper. No additions, no middle names to soften it, no titles to disguise it. Just her. And for the first time in her life, that name didn't feel like something to hide. It felt like the beginning of something true. The morning of the ceremony began not with chaos, not with the rush of stylists or shrieks of bridesmaids, but with silence. Ivy rose early, as she always did, not because anyone ordered her to, but because the habit of early rising was still stitched into the fabric of her being. But this time, she didn't reach for cleaning cloths or trays. She sat in bed, staring out the large bay window of her suite, watching the pink wash of dawn stretch across the sky. The house that was now hers, was quiet, serene, a reflection of the woman she was becoming. Below, through the glass, she could see the garden being arranged. Florists moved like dancers among the pathways, carefully placing pale lilies and white hydrangeas in clusters around the stone columns. Gold-framed chairs were being lined in two perfect rows on the central lawn. A harpist, already dressed in a deep blue gown, was tuning the strings of her instrument beside a low marble fountain. Ivy watched it all as if watching someone else's life. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her heart beat with steady, quiet strength. In a few hours, the name Ivy Harper would be spoken before an audience of people who would bow when she entered, who would rise when she passed, who would, perhaps for the first time in her life, listen when she spoke. And not because she screamed or demanded or performed, but because she had earned their respect by surviving, and by doing so without bitterness. The dress hung near the window, suspended from a gold hook that Daniel had installed himself. It was nothing like the ones Mira and her daughters used to flaunt, those ostentatious displays of wealth and status, all glitter and noise. Ivy's dress was simple, elegant, flowing ivory silk that caught the light in soft waves. Along the hem, subtle hand-sewn vines crept in pale thread, like the ones she once drew in the margins of her sketchbooks as a girl. There was no corset, no jewels, only freedom and pride. As she dressed, the stylists moved around her with deference, not intrusion. One of them, a soft-spoken woman named Maeve, adjusted Ivy's curls gently and whispered, "You look like someone who's walked through fire." Ivy smiled faintly. "I did," she said. By the time the guests began to arrive, the estate, now called Harper House at Daniel's insistence, was humming with low music and polite conversation. Cars with dark windows and subtle insignias rolled through the gates. Influential figures stepped out in tailored suits and designer gowns. Reporters waited at a respectful distance, cameras lowered unless given permission. Every detail had been orchestrated with care, not for spectacle, but for reverence. Daniel stood beneath the arch of ivy and flowers, dressed in a deep navy suit, his posture strong, his expression calm. There was no wheelchair. There hadn't been for months. His health had returned, but more than that, his dignity. And beside him, his best man, a retired judge, stood with a warm expression and a folder of vows in hand. When Ivy stepped onto the stone path, escorted not by a father, but by her own courage, a hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned, people rose, and in that moment, Ivy felt no fear. Her steps were light but sure. Her dress flowed behind her like a whisper of the girl she once was. Her hands held nothing, but her presence filled the space entirely. She reached Daniel, and he looked at her the way a man might look at sunrise after years in darkness. The ceremony itself was short. Daniel spoke his vows clearly, with a voice that trembled only when he said her name. Ivy's own vows were simple. She spoke of peace, of beginnings, of choosing someone who had chosen her before the world knew her value. She did not cry. Not then, only when the officiant declared them husband and wife, and Daniel leaned close and whispered, "You are home now," did her eyes fill. Applause rang out, respectful and restrained. Then came music. Soft jazz drifting over the lawn and trays of food from local caterers Ivy had chosen herself. There were no celebrity chefs, no pretentious menus, just nourishment, lovingly prepared, shared under golden evening light. Daniel led Ivy through the guest, introducing her not as a mystery, not as a wife found in secret, but as an equal, as a force. She shook hands with women who had once ignored her at galas. She exchanged smiles with CEOs who had never looked twice at the girl carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres. And through it all, she remained composed. She was no longer the girl in the shadows. In one quiet moment, she excused herself and stepped into the house, needing a breath. She passed through the corridors and into her old study, a room Daniel had kept untouched until she was ready. Inside were shelves of books, rolls of drafting paper, and a wide desk with a skylight above it. On the far wall hung a single framed sketch, a small house with rounded windows and ivy creeping up the sides, her first drawing. She stared at it for a long time. When she returned to the garden, the sky was blushing with sunset. Daniel met her at the edge of the path, his hand outstretched. She took it without hesitation. Together, they returned to the center of the lawn, where a microphone had been placed before a small stage. He helped her up gently. The guests quieted. Ivy took the mic, her fingers light on the stem. "I never thought I would speak at a place like this," she began, her voice low but steady. "I never thought I would stand before you as anything more than a name people didn't want to say." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, then stilled. "I was once unwanted, forgotten, discarded, not because of anything I did, but because of where I came from, because of what I looked like, because someone decided I wasn't enough." Her gaze swept the audience. No one looked away. But someone saw me, not as broken, not as something to be pitied, but as whole, as valuable, and that changed everything. Daniel's eyes never left her. "This house," she continued, "bears my name now, not because I bought it, not because I married into it, but because I built myself after being torn apart, and that is something no one can take from me." She paused, letting the silence hold her words like a sacred weight. To every girl who's ever been told she's not enough, who's been made to feel small, know this: you are not what they call you. You are not the role they force on you. You are your own story. Then, more quietly, with a smile, my name is Ivy Harper, and I am no longer silent. The applause was thunderous, not wild, not chaotic, but deep, long, full of reverence. Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed and the garden emptied of clinking glasses and murmured farewells, Ivy stood on the balcony of her room, the city skyline twinkling far beyond the hills. The wind lifted her veil gently. Below, Daniel sat on the steps, looking up at the stars. She went to him, bare feet on cool stone, and sat beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The house behind them, now lit with soft golden sconces, no longer held shadows. It held history. It held her name. In the weeks that followed the wedding, the house Ivy now called home transformed from a place of quiet restoration into a beacon of purposeful movement. What had begun as a sanctuary slowly became the headquarters of a mission. Ivy's days filled not only with light, but with intention. Each morning, she awoke early, as always, not out of fear or habit, but with the calm discipline of someone who understood what it meant to reclaim time. She walked through the halls of Harper House as its rightful keeper, not as a guest, not as a wife in someone else's domain, but as a woman who had etched her identity into the very walls. Her first project came to life almost without conscious effort. It began as a conversation, an idea shared over tea with Daniel as they sat in the sun-drenched corner of the library. He had asked her what she wanted to do with her name, now that it no longer had to hide. She had paused, eyes distant, thinking not of ballrooms or philanthropy luncheons, but of faces she had seen. Faces like her own, who lived in silence and under ceilings too low to stand straight. "I want to build something," she had said finally, "for girls like me. A place where they don't have to earn safety or beg for it." Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then we will build it." The Grace Initiative was born 2 weeks later. At first, Ivy thought the name would be Harper House Foundation or something elegant and tied to her married life. But the more she sat with it, the more she realized that what she wanted had to reflect not what she had gained through marriage, but what she had claimed for herself. Grace. Not just as a word, but as a posture, a form of power that did not scream, but held. A form of healing that came not from forgetting, but from facing everything and choosing softness anyway. It was the word she gave herself. It was the word Mira never could have spoken sincerely. It was the thing she had grown into when no one was watching. The foundation focused on girls from broken homes, on teenagers thrown into servitude by families who saw them as burdens. It helped domestic workers who had been exploited, girls pulled from abusive homes, and orphans left behind by systems that failed them. It provided housing, legal support, education, and, most of all, community. Ivy didn't just want to be a benefactor. She wanted to walk the halls of the safe houses herself. She wanted to sit in the same plastic chairs, eat the same meals, and listen, not as a savior, but as someone who understood. The first home opened 3 towns away in a converted church rectory. Ivy decorated it herself. She chose earth tones and sunlight, open-plan rooms, soft beds with hand-woven quilts, and windows that faced east so the sun could always find them. She insisted on kitchens that were open and stocked with fresh fruit and shelves of books in every common room. The library was her favorite room. It had a skylight and a floor-to-ceiling corkboard where girls could pin drawings, poems, photographs. their names if they chose to write them. In one of those early days, as Ivy stood beside a young girl barely 16, who showed her a pencil sketch of a small house surrounded by trees, something inside her shifted again. She didn't speak. She just reached out and touched the girl's hand. They didn't need words. Some recognition passes through silence deeper than any vow. Daniel supported her at every step, but he never stood in front of her. He didn't use her name to open doors. He let her walk first. When donors asked about the project, he deferred to her. When press requested statements, he redirected them. "Ask Ivy," he'd say. "It's her vision." Public interest in Ivy surged. The tabloids called her the Quiet Queen. Blogs dubbed her the woman who married a billionaire and gave it all away. Magazine features wanted to profile her transformation, but Ivy declined most interviews. She had no desire to be famous. She had a desire to be effective. Once, during a rare press event, a reporter asked her why she had never publicly addressed her past, why she had never spoken about Mira Winslow or the conditions she had lived in before marrying Daniel. The question hung in the air. Cameras clicked, pens poised. Ivy simply said, "Because the people who tried to bury me don't deserve to be remembered louder than the ones I'm trying to lift." The answer was quoted everywhere. It trended for days. But at home, Ivy rarely checked social media. She spent her evenings with Daniel in their garden or curled up reading by the fire. She had learned to smile again, and not just in photographs. She laughed, sometimes freely, sometimes with that tentative air of someone who was still learning that joy wouldn't be punished. She took long walks alone. She wrote in notebooks. She filled entire pages with dreams she had once buried. And yet, in the quiet corners of her spirit, pain still hummed. She felt it at night when memories crept into her dreams. Mira's voice, Ashley's laughter, the cold of the tile floor beneath her knees as she scrubbed it. She felt it when she passed young women in the grocery store with bruises hidden under long sleeves. She felt it when she received letters from girls in the program thanking her for giving them back their names. One evening, she sat by the fire with Daniel and told him, "I'm happy, but sometimes I still feel hollow, like there's a room in me no one can enter." He had nodded, not with alarm, but understanding. "That room is yours," he had said. "You get to decide if it ever needs to be filled. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is protect the parts of us that never had protection before." She wept softly into his chest that night, not from sorrow, but from the relief of being heard. In the spring, Daniel commissioned a statue in Ivy's honor, not for display in some gallery or wealthy enclave, but for the garden of the Second Grace home. It was not a grand sculpture of a woman in regal pose. Instead, it was a simple figure, barefoot, arms outstretched, a little girl curled safely in her lap. The plaque at the base read only, "For the ones they tried to silence." Ivy visited it alone one morning and sat beside it for an hour. A girl from the home brought her tea in a paper cup and sat next to her. She didn't ask who the statue was. She only said, "It's nice to see someone who looks like me sitting in stone like that." That night, Ivy wrote in her journal, "I think I've finally come home inside myself." When summer arrived, the foundation had already helped over 200 girls. Some had gone back to school. Some had found work. Some were still learning how to smile again. Ivy knew the journey wasn't linear, but she walked it with them, step by step, name by name. One day, she returned home from a visit to one of the homes to find Daniel waiting for her with an envelope. It bore the city crest and a wax seal. Inside was an official deed. The third property, donated to the foundation by an anonymous benefactor, would be registered not under Grace Initiative, not under Daniel Sloan, but under Ivy's full birth name, Ivy Ophelia Harper. It was the first legal document since her father's death that recognized her as sole owner of anything. She stood at the window for a long time that evening, the paper pressed to her chest. She had been called many things: servant, burden, bastard, ghost. But now, with her signature beneath the seal, she finally understood. She was not what they had named her. She was what she chose. She was Grace. Rain drummed gently against the high-arched windows of Harper House, wrapping the world in a curtain of sound that seemed to soften even the edges of thought. The day had begun gray and still, with fog clinging to the hedgerows and the trees standing solemn, as though nature itself had paused to listen. Inside, Ivy moved quietly through the halls, her fingertips grazing the polished wood banister as she descended the stairs. The mansion no longer felt too large or too grand. It had grown to fit her spirit the way old skin fits a healed wound, marked but whole. She had returned late the night before from the dedication ceremony of the 4th Grace Care home, located deep in a rural district often forgotten by the larger city's planners. It had been a modest affair by public standards, but monumental to Ivy. There, beneath a canopy of flowering jacarandas, she had listened to a 13-year-old girl recite a poem she'd written about being seen. The girl's voice shook at first, then steadied as she finished. Ivy had stood and embraced her without words, the girl's tears wetting the silk of her sleeve. The moment had clung to Ivy all night, clung to her even now as she wandered into the library, still in her travel clothes, hair damp from the mist outside. Daniel was already awake, sipping coffee and reading a legal brief at the table. He looked up when she entered and smiled in that quiet way he reserved for the early hours. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "I tried," she replied, slipping into the chair beside him. They sat in peaceful silence for a while, the kind that only two people who truly knew one another could share. Ivy wrapped her hands around a warm mug and let herself settle into the moment, but the stillness was broken by the gentle knock of the butler at the door. "Madam," he said with an edge of hesitation, "there are visitors." She turned her head, confused. "Who?" "I believe they are from your past," he said carefully. "3 women and an older lady, soaked to the bone. They gave no name, but I thought—" Ivy stood before he could finish. She walked to the foyer slowly, her pulse steady but cold beneath her skin. The heavy oak doors loomed ahead, tall and unmoved by time. The butler opened them and the wind swept in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, something faintly desperate. There, standing in the rain, were Mira Winslow and her daughters. They were barely recognizable. Gone were the tailored coats, the manicured hair, the painted smiles. Their clothes clung to their skin, ruined by rain and road dust. Their eyes, once so sharp with contempt, now looked swollen and rimmed with red. Mira's makeup had melted in streaks down her cheeks. She didn't hold her chin up like she used to. Instead, she crumbled to her knees the moment she saw Ivy. "My daughter," Mira sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please forgive me. I didn't know. God help me, I didn't know." Behind her, Lauren and Ashley lowered themselves as well, eyes wide and glassy, mouths trembling with unsaid things. Ashley's voice cracked. "We were wrong," Lauren added. "We mocked what we didn't understand. We thought we were better, but we weren't." Ivy didn't move. She stood in the doorway, framed by warmth and light, and watched them tremble in the storm they had once created for her. Mira clutched at her soaked shawl, her hands shaking. I don't ask for your riches, Ivy. I don't ask for your name. Just a chance. Just mercy. The irony struck Ivy with the precision of fate. These were the women who once threw her out like waste, who laughed as they handed her to what they thought was a man incapable of standing on his own. They had taken her father's house, her childhood, her dignity, and now, as their world crumbled beneath them, they had come to the door of the girl they tried to erase. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "I'm not your daughter," she said. Mira's head jerked up, eyes wide. "You made that very clear," Ivy continued. "When you took everything my father left me, when you made me sleep beside rats, when you called me names that stuck like scars, you made sure I knew I didn't belong." The rain grew heavier. None of the women rose. "If you came for money, I owe you nothing. If you came for mercy, I gave it to myself long ago." Ashley whimpered. Lauren wept openly now, her shoulders shaken with a grief she had never learned to contain. "I do remember every moment," Ivy said, "but I don't live in that place anymore, and I will not let you drag me back to it." She turned to the butler. "Give them food, something dry to wear, then send them away." "Yes, madam." Ivy walked back inside, her footsteps echoing in the great hall. Daniel met her in the corridor and took her hand. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble, but she held his fingers tighter than usual. "I didn't speak out of anger," she said quietly. "I just needed to say it." "I know," he said, "and you were right to." That night, Ivy sat by the window in her reading chair, the storm still whispering against the glass. She wore a simple shawl and cradled a cup of chamomile tea, letting the steam warm her face. Daniel came in, placing a small kiss on her temple before sitting nearby. "You were strong," he said again. "I just told the truth," she answered. He nodded. "That's what strength is?" She didn't reply, but a single tear slid down her cheek, not from sadness, but from release. Some doors were meant to stay closed, some chapters didn't need revisiting, and some victories didn't come with cheers, only silence and peace. In the following months, Ivy threw herself into the expansion of the Grace Initiative. With each new home opened, each scholarship awarded, each rescued girl given back her voice, the echoes of her past grew softer. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't put her name in headlines. She simply worked, quietly, purposefully, like someone who had nothing left to prove but everything to give. One morning, as she stood before the mirror in her room, she wore a white gown once more. Not for a wedding, but for her church ceremony. A celebration of faith, of second chances, of beginnings. Her belly had begun to swell slightly, the first hint of the life she carried. She placed her hand gently over it, smiling. Daniel entered, already dressed in a clean, pale suit. He watched her with eyes full of reverence. "You look like a dream," he said softly. She turned, tears in her lashes. "Thank you for choosing me," she whispered, "when I was just a shadow in a broken house." "You were never a shadow," he said, walking toward her. "You were just covered in dust. Now the world sees your light." The ceremony was held in a chapel on the grounds of Harper House. Children from the foundation lined the aisle, tossing petals as Ivy walked past. Business leaders, artists, women who had once been girls in hiding, all stood for her. The vows were spoken again, not to claim, but to celebrate. To remind the world that love built on honor is the rarest kind. At the reception, Ivy stood on a small stage and held the microphone, her voice low but steady. "I want to thank all of you," she said, "not just for being here today, but for believing in a woman who once slept on a floor. This isn't about wealth. This isn't about titles. This is about hope. The hall fell silent. I was once called unwanted, a maid, a mistake. But someone saw me, treated me with dignity, and that gave me the courage to become who I am today. She paused, looking over the room. Daniel stood at the back, clapping already, tears in his eyes. Sometimes, the ones the world throws away are the ones sent to rebuild it. My name is Ivy Harper, and I carry it now with pride. Applause erupted, not of obligation, but of awe. That night, as they drove home through the quiet streets, Ivy leaned her head against the window and whispered, "God, I don't know why you chose to lift me, but I will never forget where I came from." Daniel took her hand. "You don't need to forget. That's where your strength was born." And in that silence, Ivy knew she wasn't just a wife or a leader. She was a symbol, a testimony, a name they had tried to erase, now carved into stone and memory. She was Ivy, and the world would never forget it again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other powerful stories and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means everything.